Hey everyone, welcome to our daily devotion. We find ourselves in Matthew chapter 6, right in the middle of the great Sermon on the Mount. Now, at the end of Matthew 5, he talked about how you've heard it said one thing in the law, but he is calling us to consider not just the outward manifestation of religion, but the inward transformation of the gospel. So you've heard it said this, but I tell you this. Chapter 6, he continues that, but not so much about law as it is about practical living. So in the first three sections of chapter 6, Jesus looks at common religious practices which are good, but if done with the wrong motives, serve no purpose whatsoever. Those are charity, prayer, and with that, forgiveness, and also fasting. All of these are related because a person who's been transformed by God is a charitable, generous person, is a person of prayer, a person who practices forgiveness, and yes, even a person who fasts. You'll notice there in verses 1 to 4, he talks about charity. Now, one of the things you need to notice in all three of these is the language, the specific language Jesus uses. He doesn't say, if you feel like giving today, here's a model you can follow. Rather, Jesus presumes you are giving. So there in verse 2, he says, thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you. That is to say that Jesus assumes that those living the blessed life in the kingdom of God will be charitable. They will be generous. So the first thing we need to see is the expectation Jesus has for you and me to be generous to others, regardless of whether that's financial generosity, generosity with our time, and whatever it might be. So he says, when you give, don't just make sure that the local media has been contacted and the size of the check is bigger than your front door. Rather, he says, generosity should be a matter of the heart, not a matter of popularity. Right? This isn't something that we do for public relations, but rather we do it because our hearts are full with the generosity of God, and so we give to others. So when you give, then don't sound the trumpet as hypocrites in the synagogue and in the streets. Notice he's saying that this is a universal problem for the religious and non-religious. And how many people want to make sure that they'll give a lot of money so long as that whatever it is, that building, that wing, that hall, that room, whatever, is dedicated or they're honored because of that gift. I'm not saying those things are necessarily bad. I am saying, but if your motivation for generosity is that people might think of you as being generous, you've already surrendered the gift. All right, you're really not contributing at all to the kingdom of God. The same thing is said regarding prayer. He says there in verse 5, when you pray, not if you pray, when you pray. And I would suggest that one of the clear signs of a weak spiritual life is the lack of prayer or the poor quality of prayer. So if you find yourself just not praying at all, or praying with repetition, or praying Miss America's Prayer or something like that, that is a sign of a weak spiritual life that you're going through. Prayer is a vital part of the spiritual disciplines. And so Jesus says, when you pray, don't be like all the hypocrites. They want to stand in the synagogue. They want to pray with their hands raised. They want people to marvel at how great prayer they are. Right? We get a picture of this in Luke 18, where you have a tax collector who looks down, beats his chest, and simply prays, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now that's a good prayer because it's an honest prayer. It's a prayer from the heart, crying out to help for God. Next to him is a Pharisee, but he's not next to him in the sense they're shoulder to shoulder. Rather, the tax collector's on the outside of the temple, but the Pharisee's right in the middle of the temple where everyone can see him, and his arms are raised, and he looks up to the heavens, and he brags to God about himself. God, I'm glad you didn't make me like that tax collector. Here's my spiritual resume. I tithe and I give and I do all this sort of stuff. Right? That's the prayer of a hypocrite. If all you do is is rambling repetition because you read it in a book once or because you saw it on a bumper sticker, or you're praying for the purpose to be seen. It's not real prayer. And in order to show us what prayer looks like, Jesus provides for us a model prayer. Sometimes it's called the Lord's Prayer. Sometimes we can call it the disciples' prayer. It's really just a model prayer. Now, let me just say, Jesus just told us to guard against mindless repetition. You can say all day long, rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub, yay God, and think somehow that makes you a spiritual person and your food is blessed. Right? That's not a real prayer, no matter how well you have it memorized. So too, just memorizing the Lord's Prayer doesn't mean you've actually prayed. It just means you recited a bunch of words you had memorized. And so the Lord's Prayer is to be a model for us, but there isn't any special power in the Lord's Prayer. So you'll notice how he emphasizes things like adoration. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done. It's striking in that prayer how God-centered the prayer is. The purpose of the prayer isn't to get from God, it is to get God. And you can't get God without lifting God up. And this is why prayer is such a vital spiritual discipline, because it isn't just, God, I need help, show up now, please, but rather it is a confession on our tongue before the God, our Creator, Redeemer, of who He is, and how often in our lives do we need to be remembered of that. You know, also he says that give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Notice that his supplication is both spiritual supplication and, yes, physical supplication. Yes, there is the give us this day our daily bread, our basic necessities, not our wants, not our desires, but our basic necessities. And then from those necessities comes thanksgiving to God. God, I thank you for who you are and what you've done and how you continue to bless me though I don't deserve it. But in supplication isn't just the physical need, it's the spiritual needs. Don't lead us into temptation. Help us overcome the evil one. Forgive us of our many sins as we forgive others. Jesus shows us that there's a connection between a person who has a heart of forgiveness, has been forgiven, and understands that it is hypocritical to receive the forgiveness of God, but not extend the forgiveness of God. Right? And he'll illustrate this later with the parable of the unforgivable servant. Having been forgiven of millions of dollars, if you will, he won't forgive the lunch money that someone borrowed from him some time ago. Right? So to receive the forgiveness of God, we must give with liberty the forgiveness of God. So there you have the Lord's Prayer. Use it as a model. And yes, I do think there is at times when we should recite it, but what a helpful prayer it is to guide us in our own prayers. Then he talks about a subject that Southern Baptists don't want to talk about, and that is to our own detriment, and that is fasting. For some reason, American evangelicals have convinced themselves that fasting is unnecessary. Now, I don't think that fasting is a secret recipe to getting something from God. I don't think that's at all. The purpose of fasting isn't to make your prayers more powerful. It is a spiritual discipline that leads us into greater communion with God. The Bible connects our appetites with our desires. Adam and Eve with the fruit, Jesus with turning stones into bread, Esau giving up his birthright for stew, the Israelites crying out for manna and craving that their hunger be filled. And so the appetites becomes a picture of our desire, our cravings. Right? And so fasting then becomes a physical way to understand that my greatest need is met, not in temporary things of this world, but ultimately in God. And fasting is something I really wish that I could get better at and that American evangelicals would get better at. Prior to the coronavirus, we instituted fasting here at the church. And so we had a prayer ministry that met on Mondays. And we haven't done that for a few weeks in light of COVID-19. But one of the things we would do is we would meet at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And we asked people that if they can, to fast until then. And so by the time we were done and I was finally able to get some food, it could be like 3:30, 4 o'clock before I was able to eat lunch. But then by then, it's about time for me to go home, and they're talking about supper. But I realized just eventually what I found was, yeah, there's hunger pains. But eventually, when your heart is geared towards prayer, you think less of food. See, when your mind is on heavenly things, you are less consumed by temporary earthly things. So it isn't that Jesus says, if you fast, but when you fast. Don't do it like the hypocrites who disfigure their faces so that their fasting may be seen by others. Rather, he says, wash your face and anoint your head and move on. And people don't need to know that you're fasting. You don't need to tweet about it. You need to take a sad picture with a sad emoji in the caption and put it on your Instagram story. That's not what we need to do. Rather, understand that the purpose of these spiritual disciplines is to grow in intimacy with God, to demonstrate the love of God. You see, if you truly care about people, you're going to pray for them. And if you're serious about prayer, I believe you'll take seriously the command to fast. We never see fasting without prayer, but often we see prayer associated with fasting. From there, he gives us some very practical advice. Two things. One is laying treasures up in heaven. Boy, do we Americans need to hear that. And one of the hard lessons we're having to learn in the coronavirus, a lesson I hope we learn, is how unredemptive consumerism is. We have spent so many decades, many of us have grown up our entire lives seeing ourselves as consumers. And so we consume and we collect and we show off, and our lives are centered around entertainment and stuff. And Jesus says there in verse 19, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Why? Because rust is going to get them. Moths will destroy them. Thieves will steal them. Rather, if you want to live the blessed life, find contentment here and store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where nothing can steal, kill, or rust. Where your treasure is, this is the issue. Where your treasure is, verse 21, there your heart will be also. So you should be able to right now look at your bank account and tell me, where is your heart? You should be able to look at your home and the decisions you make, and those should be reflective of where your heart is. Is your heart on things above? Or are you so focused about this world you don't have the time or the vision for the things of God? Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Seek His kingdom, His righteousness, and you will live a blessed life. The last thing he says there, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because we're actually going to look at it Sunday morning, and that is the exhortation regarding being anxious. And the two are connected. And in fact, he concludes his section on laying up treasures in heaven by saying, you cannot serve God and money. That the word there for serve carries with it the idea of slavery. You would either be a slave of one or the other. You cannot be faithful to both gods. Either you'll be faithful to the one true and living God, or you will be faithful to this other God. Consumerism, finances, greed, or we could add a dozen other gods that we may worship. And so that carries on to what he says in verse 25. I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you'll eat, what you drink, nor about your body, what you'll put on. Is life not more than food, and the body more than clothing? Again, we Americans desperately need to hear this message. Can I give you a little hint here? A lesson that we've got to learn? Consumerism stirs anxiety. Greed, lust, all of those idols stir anxiety. Because they pick up on the language of appetites and slavery. So whenever you eat, you may be satisfied for a moment, but it won't be long before you're rummaging through the cabinets in the refrigerator again. So too, if what you pursue is a god of the appetites, like consumerism or lust or something, what you're going to find is you're satisfied for a time, but you're not satisfied forever. And so you're going to be spinning your wheels and running around and going and going and going. And what you find is an increased level of stress and anxiety and uncertainty and fear and a fear of missing out. And what if I don't measure up and all of this sort of stuff. And so you'll log on Facebook and everyone else seems to be happy, but your life isn't happy. Everyone else's life seems to be perfect, but your life isn't perfect. Everyone else seems to have the American dream, but I don't have the American dream. I've got to run harder. I've got to push farther. I've got to work harder, all this sort of stuff. And it stirs in us anxiety because we're worried to death about tomorrow because we're dissatisfied with today. But Jesus says, look, if you're worshiping God and no one else, because you can't serve two idols, the good news is you can surrender the side effects of idolatry, of anxiety, fear, worry, and stress. Because what you'll find is God is alone. God is sufficient alone. And that is why he concludes chapter 6, therefore do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. And between those two verses, Jesus reminds us of the sovereign grace of God. He is enough if only we let him be enough in our lives. Lord willing, we'll see you guys here tomorrow.